Hey everyone, Mr. Sujano here. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the Super Nintendo Classic Mini Edition controller. We're going to open it up and directly compare it to the SNES original controller to see how it stacks up. As an added bonus, I'm also going to be opening up the 8BitDo SNES30 Bluetooth controller and comparing all three. Let's get started. All right, so here are the two controllers we're looking at today. On the left side is the SNES Classic Mini controller. On the right side is the Super Nintendo, the original controller. And just for fun, we're also going to throw in the 8BitDo controller to look at as well. So this is the SNES30 by 8BitDo. It is a Bluetooth controller. You can see here the LED lights that kind of give it away and the micro USB port. All right, so I'm going to take my trusty screwdriver, open all three of these controllers up, and inspect the differences. All right, on the left side is the old Super Nintendo controller screw, and on the right side is the screw from the SNES Mini controller. You can see there's a difference in size and shape between the two, as well as color. I'm going to move those out of the way so I don't lose them anywhere here. All right, so on the bottom you have the case from the SNES regular controller, and on the top you have the bottom of the case from the SNES Mini controller. All right, so here are the controllers side by side, the regular SNES controller on my right and the SNES Classic Mini controller on the left. I'm noticing the shoulder circuit boards for the shoulder buttons are thinner on the SNES Mini controller. The board itself looks thinner on the SNES Mini controller, but the shoulder button boards do look taller on the SNES Mini controller. All right, let's take these out. So here is the main difference between the circuit boards on the SNES Mini Classic and the regular SNES. The regular SNES is on the right. You can also see copyright 1992, and the SNES Classic controller is on the left here. So there's a closer up shot of the two boards, the regular SNES controller on the bottom and the SNES Mini Classic controller on the top. We have the SNES regular controller on the bottom and the SNES Mini Classic controller here on the top. The internals look largely the same in terms of styling. I can see the start button and select button are a little different between the two controllers here. So here's the internals without the silicone coverings on them. You can see the pegs on the regular SNES buttons are slightly larger than on the SNES Mini. In terms of D-pads, I have the old SNES D-pad on my left and the new SNES Mini D-pad on the right. And from a styling perspective, they are almost identical. The main difference is this rocker peg here is a little smaller on the SNES Mini Classic than it is on the SNES regular controller. All right, here is the X button from the regular SNES controller and the SNES Mini Classic controller. So the SNES Mini Classic controller is this button here, and the regular SNES controller is here. Notice the difference in peg length, and actually the top peg is missing entirely from the SNES Mini Classic controller. All right, now we're gonna look at shoulder buttons. Here is the shoulder button from the regular SNES controller. It's got the metal bar that slides in, as well as this blue silicone pad that goes in like that. On the SNES Mini Classic controller, the shoulder button is different, as the plastic button is all one piece. There is no metal peg that sticks in, and the silicone peg, or the silicone button, actually is a square as opposed to the round one from the regular SNES controller. But peg length on the silicone button is roughly the same. All right, and just for fun here, this is the back of the 8-bit Do controller. You can see how it compares to the SNES regular controller and the SNES Mini Classic controller. So the 8-bit Do controller has a noticeable box there for the lithium-ion battery. But besides that, it actually is closer to resembling the actual SNES controller than the SNES Mini does. So here's the circuit board from the 8-bit Do controller on the very bottom here. The regular SNES controller is in the middle, and the SNES Mini Classic controller is on the top. And in terms of button pads for the 8-bit Do, they are extremely similar to that of the regular Super Nintendo. So this is the regular Super Nintendo button pad. This is the 8-bit Do button pad. They are largely the same. The SNES Mini button pad, you can see here, differs slightly. So 8-bit Do, regular SNES controller, SNES Mini controller. On the top here you have the SNES Mini Classic controller. In the middle you have the regular SNES controller, and on the bottom here you have the 8-bit Do controller. As you can see, the 8-bit Do controller more closely resembles the start and select buttons than the SNES Classic Mini. Here are the 3 D-pads. One from the SNES Classic, one from the original SNES, and one from the 8-bit Do. If you flip them over, they're all virtually identical, except the 8-bit Do one's slightly darker, and the SNES Mini Classic one has that more narrow center rocker peg that the actual D-pad balances on. Whereas the 8-bit Do and the SNES original are actually pretty darn close to each other. All right, here is the X button from all 3 controllers. The big difference between them, the 8-bit Do's and the regular SNES controller are actually similar. They're nearly identical, whereas the SNES Classic Mini controller has shorter and wider little pegs here to hold the button in place.
So there's all three. This is the SNES Mini Classic. This is the, oh geez. This is, I believe, this is the SNES regular controller, and this is the 8-bit DOE. And the only way I could tell the difference between the SNES original controller and the 8-bit DOE was to actually just look on the inside of the buttons there to match them up. So the SNES Mini Classic controllers the buttons are very different in terms of the peg and the inside style. They all share the exact same dimensions though in terms of height and width. And in regards to the 8-bit DOE shoulder buttons, you actually can't remove them. They're glued in and they kind of just spring on their own here. Whereas the SNES Mini Classic controller and the original SNES controller have removable shoulder buttons and more closely resemble each other. So that is the big difference between all three controllers. These two are very similar for shoulder buttons, whereas the 8-bit DOE is kind of a little different, to say the least here.
All right, so that was all three controllers compared. I was actually extremely surprised to see that the 8-bit DOE controller more mimics the original SNES controller than the SNES Classic Edition Mini. That being said, all three controllers feel extremely similar. The D-pad is ever so slightly different on the Super Nintendo Classic Edition Mini, although regular gamers probably won't notice much of a difference at all. That being said, please hit that subscribe button. I'm getting close to 1,000 and I'm trying to push for that 1,000 subscribers. That's all I've got for today. Thank you everyone. Take care.